At 7:07 a.m. on February 16, 1945, USS Tennessee sat 3,000 yards off the southeastern shore of Iwo Jima, her four massive turrets rotating with surprising smoothness toward Mount Suribachi. Inside Turret 2, the gunnery officer watched through his optical rangefinder as the volcanic mountain filled his view. The slopes were honeycombed with fortifications that 3 days of bombardment by destroyers and cruisers had failed to destroy. He could see Japanese gun positions that intelligence had marked as neutralized still intact. Concrete bunkers that should have been rubble. Tunnel entrances that should have been collapsed. The order came through the fire control circuit. Target designated Baker 7. Range 9,800 yards. Mount Suribachi northern face. Armor-piercing shell. The loading crew in the turret below moved with mechanical precision. A 14-inch armor-piercing projectile, 5 feet tall and weighing 1,560 pounds, was hoisted from the magazine and loaded into the breech. Behind it went a silk powder bag containing 425 pounds of propellant. The breech block slammed shut with the sound of industrial machinery engaging. The gunnery officer made his final adjustments. The gun elevated to 22 degrees. The turret settled onto target. He pressed the firing key. The gun fired with a sound that was felt before it was heard. The entire ship shuddered. The 14-inch barrel recoiled violently backward, its massive recoil mechanism absorbing forces that would have torn a lesser weapon apart. A tongue of orange flame, 50 feet long, erupted from the muzzle. The shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second, its trajectory arcing across 4 miles of ocean toward a concrete blockhouse protecting a Japanese 120mm coastal gun. The shell hit the blockhouse at an angle, penetrated through 6 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, traveled 15 feet into the structure, and then detonated. The entire blockhouse vanished, not collapsed, not damaged, vanished. The explosion killed everyone inside and sent a pressure wave through the connected tunnel system that killed soldiers 200 yards away. Where the fortification had stood, there was now a crater 20 feet deep, filled with pulverized concrete and volcanic rock. A Marine Lieutenant Colonel named Donald Weller, watching from a command post on the beach, later wrote in his report that the structure simply ceased to exist. The gun crew and the position had been completely destroyed with a single shell. I spent 6 hours writing, editing, and posting this video. If this story matters to you, the only thing I ask is that you hit the subscribe button. Just subscribe, that's all. Thank you. The problem that faced American forces in the Pacific by early 1945 was not a shortage of firepower. The United States Navy could put more steel on target than any military force in history. The challenge was that the steel was not working. The shells were hitting. They were detonating. They were creating spectacular explosions that looked devastating from the air and from ships offshore, but they were not destroying the fortifications that mattered. This became horrifyingly clear at Iwo Jima. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand, dominated by Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano rising 554 feet above the southern beaches. Under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, Japanese forces had spent 8 months transforming the island into a subterranean fortress specifically designed to survive American naval bombardment. Kuribayashi was one of the most capable commanders Japan possessed. He had served as a military attaché in the United States and Canada during the 1930s. He had driven across America. He had seen Detroit's industrial capacity. He understood exactly what the American military could bring to bear against his position, and he designed his defenses accordingly. He ordered the construction of 11 miles of tunnels, connecting 1,500 defensive positions. Every major fortification was protected by 6 feet of steel-reinforced concrete and buried under additional meters of volcanic rock. Gun positions incorporated heavy steel doors that crews could close during bombardment and reopen to engage landing craft. Command bunkers sat 20 to 30 feet underground, accessible only through concealed tunnel entrances. Artillery positions were positioned to cover every meter of the landing beaches, with interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese had learned from the bloody lessons of Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan. At those battles, American naval bombardment had been devastating because Japanese defenses relied on coconut log bunkers. light concrete pillboxes, and surface positions. Kuribayashi abandoned that approach entirely. He accepted that American warships would dominate the sea and deliver massive preliminary bombardments. His strategy was to bury everything underground where conventional naval shells could not reach it, then fight a brutal battle of attrition from positions the Americans could not destroy. The pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima began on February 16, 1945. Rear Admiral William Blandy, commanding the amphibious support force, had requested a 10-day preliminary bombardment. He understood that cracking Iwo Jima's unique defenses required sustained methodical destruction of hardened targets. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, rejected the request. The operational schedule was relentless. The Iwo Jima assault had to proceed quickly to free up naval assets for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa. Blandy received authorization for 3 days. During those 3 days, heavy cruisers fired their main batteries until gun barrels showed dangerous wear. Destroyers expended entire magazines of 5-inch shells. Carrier aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. The island disappeared under a pall of smoke and dust that gave the grand impression of total devastation. Observers reported massive explosions. Aerial reconnaissance showed the landscape heavily cratered. Intelligence analysts marked positions as probably destroyed. When the bombardment ceased and the smoke cleared, the Japanese positions were still operational. The problem was physics. The 8-inch shells fired by heavy cruisers like USS Pensacola and Indianapolis were formidable weapons in ship-to-ship combat. They could penetrate the armor of enemy warships. They could set fire to surface structures, but they could not penetrate the incredibly thick concrete casements protecting Japanese coastal guns. The shells being used were primarily high-capacity rounds designed with thin casings to maximize explosive blast against surface targets like airfields or unarmored ships. They lacked the sheer mass and penetrating power needed to crack through 6 feet of steel-reinforced concrete backed by volcanic rock. When they hit Japanese fortifications, they created spectacular explosions on the surface. Reconnaissance aircraft photographing the same positions hours later showed only minimal cosmetic damage. The fortifications themselves remained intact. The 5-inch destroyer rounds were even less effective. Destroyers operating dangerously close to shore had pumped thousands of shells into suspected defensive positions. These lighter projectiles were devastating against surface structures and any personnel caught in the open. Against hardened fortifications, they proved almost useless. Photographic intelligence showed countless impact craters pocking the terrain around Japanese positions, but the positions themselves remained stubbornly operational. In one particularly telling incident, a Baltimore-class cruiser scored 3 consecutive 8-inch hits on a concrete blockhouse protecting a 120mm coastal gun. Spotters confidently reported the structure as destroyed. When Marines landed 3 days later and fought their way to that position, they discovered the blockhouse entirely intact. Its gun crew, having sheltered in connecting tunnels during the bombardment, had returned to their weapon the moment the barrage lifted. The concrete facing showed shallow impact damage, but the structure's integrity remained uncompromised. Marine commanders grew increasingly alarmed. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, studied reconnaissance photographs showing landing zones covered by interlocking fields of fire from positions that seemed completely impervious to modern naval gunfire. The 3 days of intensive bombardment had failed to neutralize even a quarter of the identified defensive positions. Intelligence officers identified a defensive complex on the northern end of the island. Reconnaissance photos showed heavily reinforced concrete bunkers protecting 150mm howitzers and 120mm coastal guns, all positioned to enfilade the landing beaches. 6 heavy cruisers concentrated their fire on this position over 2 days. Observers reported multiple direct hits. Analysts marked the position as probably destroyed. When exhausted Marines finally reached the complex days later, after suffering horrendous casualties, they discovered all 4 artillery pieces fully operational. The cruiser shells had destroyed surface structures and killed Japanese troops caught in the open. The hardened gun positions themselves remained intact. Something with far more devastating power was needed. The military required weapons capable of punching through meters of reinforced concrete and creating seismic shocks that could collapse tunnel networks. Marine commanders desperately sought naval guns, firing projectiles with enough mass and velocity to crack fortifications that absorbed 8-inch shells without critical damage. The answer was already steaming toward Iwo Jima, hulking silhouettes on the horizon that many strategists in the carrier-focused Navy had dismissed as relics of a bygone era. These were the old battleships, several of them survivors of the attack on Pearl Harbor, resurrected and refitted. They carried weapons designed for a different war entirely. The ships had been built for fleet engagements against enemy battleships. Their massive 14-inch and 16-inch guns were intended to hurl armor-piercing projectiles through thick steel armor at extreme range. In an age of carrier aviation, many naval theorists considered them obsolete. But those same characteristics, their enormous projectile mass, their tremendous muzzle velocity, their ability to fire shells designed to penetrate hardened steel armor, made them potentially devastating against hardened shore fortifications. A 14-inch armor-piercing shell weighing 1,560 pounds, built to punch through 16 inches of warship armor before detonating inside a ship's vitals, possessed exactly the kind of penetrating power needed against Iwo Jima's concrete and volcanic rock. The weapon was the 14-inch 50 caliber Mark V naval gun designed in 1912 for the New Mexico and Pennsylvania class battleships. The designation meant the barrel was 50 times its 14-inch bore diameter, giving it a length of 50 feet. The gun could hurl projectiles over 17 miles. It fired two types of shells, a 1,560-pound armor-piercing round and a 1,400-pound high-capacity explosive shell. The guns were mounted in 800-ton triple turrets, protected by 18 inches of face armor. By Pearl Harbor, these ships were considered obsolete for fleet actions against newer enemy battleships with larger guns. American doctrine relegated the old 14-inch ships to convoy escort and shore bombardment, while newer 16-inch Iowa and South Dakota-class battleships hunted the enemy fleet. But shore bombardment revealed unexpected advantages. After the bloody assault on Tarawa in November 1943 exposed the inadequacy of lighter naval guns, the Navy re-evaluated its oldest battleships. The test came at Kwajalein in February 1944, where USS Tennessee and USS Pennsylvania joined the bombardment force. Fire control officers made a critical discovery. The armor-piercing shells designed to pierce warship armor were devastating against concrete fortifications. They punched through reinforced concrete that stopped smaller shells, penetrated deep into bunkers, and then detonated. The key was the .033-second delayed action fuse, which allowed the shell to travel 15 to 20 feet inside the target before exploding. A captured Japanese engineer later confirmed the effect, describing how single 14-inch hits destroyed casemates that had withstood days of bombardment, killing entire garrisons. The ships reached Iwo Jima early on February 16, 1945. USS Tennessee, USS Idaho, and USS New York took positions just 3,000 yards offshore. The plan was systematic destruction of known positions. Tennessee's gunnery officer divided Mount Suribachi's northern face into 32 target zones and methodically pounded each with 6 to 12 armor-piercing shells. The results exceeded expectations. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Donald Weller watched from his command post as a Tennessee shell struck a concrete blockhouse. In his official report, he wrote that the entire structure vanished in the explosion. No rubble remained visible. The position had been completely destroyed. The sustained fire was possible because the old battleships carried more ammunition than their modern counterparts. Tennessee's magazines held 1,350 rounds of 14-inch ammunition, significantly more than the 1,080 rounds carried by larger-gunned Iowa-class battleships. This allowed them to remain on station, providing fire support for extended periods. During the Iwo Jima campaign, Tennessee expended 2,241 rounds of 14-inch ammunition. Idaho and New York added over 3,500 rounds combined. The shells demonstrated unique tactical advantages that nobody had anticipated. Shells penetrating tunnel entrances could collapse entire underground complexes. Japanese survivors described the impacts as earthquakes that buried defenders alive. The massive concussive force traveled through the tunnel networks, killing soldiers hundreds of yards from the impact point. Fortifications that had absorbed dozens of 8-inch cruiser shells without significant damage were obliterated by single 14-inch hits. The heavy shells also proved effective against targets in defilade, positions on reverse slopes invisible to direct fire. The gun's maximum elevation of 30 degrees allowed plunging fire, dropping shells at steep angles onto the tops of bunkers. This capability became critical during Japanese counterattacks. Tennessee and Idaho provided danger close fire support, placing 14-inch shells within 300 yards of Marine positions. This was feasible thanks to the accuracy of the Mark 34 fire control director and its Mark 8 rangekeeper mechanical computer, which could place shots within 50 yards at ranges of 10,000 yards. The communication chain from spotters ashore to the battleships allowed shells to be on target in under 3 minutes. Forward observers radioed coordinates. Fire control officers calculated solutions. Guns fired. The shells impacted with devastating precision. Japanese positions that had withstood days of conventional bombardment were destroyed in minutes by weapons most naval planners had written off as obsolete. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to hear is how these old battleships fought through the 82-day campaign at Okinawa, firing more rounds than anyone thought possible, how they systematically reduced Shuri Castle and Japanese fortifications that were supposed to be impregnable, and how their performance forced the Navy to completely reconsider what these weapons could accomplish. This is the only channel showing you the forgotten innovations that won the Pacific War. Do not miss this. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945. The campaign would last 82 days and become one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater. More than 60,000 American soldiers and Marines stormed ashore to face Japanese forces anchored in defensive positions around Shuri Castle, an ancient fortress with walls 3 feet of solid limestone. The old battleships were there. Tennessee, Idaho, New York joined by other ships of their class. Their 14-inch guns would prove even more valuable at Okinawa than they had at Iwo Jima. The Japanese defensive strategy was similar to Iwo Jima, but executed on a larger scale. General Mitsuru Ushijima had fortified every ridge, every cave, every stone structure. His forces occupied positions on reverse slopes where they could not be seen from the sea. Artillery was positioned in caves with narrow firing slits. Command bunkers were buried deep underground. The entire defensive network was designed to survive preliminary bombardment and then emerge to contest every yard of ground. Tennessee alone fired 3,846 rounds during the Okinawa campaign, requiring multiple ammunition replenishments at sea. The gun systematically reduced Shuri Castle. Its 3-foot-thick limestone walls, which had stood for centuries, shattered like pottery under sustained 14-inch fire. Gunnery logs show the methodical destruction of key defensive positions. Conical Hill, a fortified position that had stopped Marine advances for days, was demolished by sustained fire from Tennessee and Idaho. Sugarloaf Hill, another fortified village built into a reverse slope, was destroyed by the plunging trajectory of heavy naval guns that could reach positions 8-inch cruiser shells could not touch. The battleships operated close to shore, often within range of Japanese coastal artillery. They absorbed counter-battery fire that would have destroyed lighter vessels. A 150mm howitzer shell that struck Tennessee's turret 2 at Okinawa merely left a dent. The old ship's heavy armor, designed to withstand battleship-caliber shells in fleet actions, made them nearly immune to Japanese coastal guns. For nighttime attacks, the battleships delivered pre-registered time-on-target barrages that saturated Japanese assembly areas. Prisoners reported that the distinctive freight train shriek of incoming 14-inch shells caused panic even among veteran troops. The sound was different from other artillery, deeper, more menacing, the kind of sound that announced something was about to be obliterated. The weapons proved unexpectedly reliable. Though designed for a 300-round barrel life, combat necessity pushed that to 400 rounds or more. Crews relined barrels between campaigns. Tennessee's No. 2 gun in Turret 1 fired 6,127 rounds during the war, without catastrophic failure. Post-battle surveys confirmed that 14-inch shells had penetrated stone, earth, and concrete. that stopped all other forms of ordnance. Japanese defensive positions that intelligence had marked as requiring aerial bombing or flamethrower assault were destroyed by naval gunfire. Fortifications that had been considered impregnable were reduced to rubble. The battleships also demonstrated tactical flexibility. When Japanese defenders adapted by dispersing their forces, the ships fired interdiction barrages across likely movement routes. When defenders concentrated for counterattacks, the ships delivered devastating time-on-target fire that broke attacks before they reached American lines. The main weakness was rate of fire. 2 rounds per minute per gun could not provide the suppressive fire of destroyers firing rapid 5-inch shells. The 14-inch guns excelled at destroying hardened targets, but were inefficient against dispersed infantry. The tactical solution was coordination. Destroyers provided suppressive fire while battleships destroyed fortifications. The cost and logistics were considerable. Each 14-inch shell cost $1,350 in 1945 dollars. The ships required specialized ammunition replenishment at sea. During the Okinawa campaign, ammunition expenditure reached rates that strained the logistics system. Production of the Mark V gun itself had ended in 1920. 7 battleships across the Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and Tennessee classes were equipped with 12-gun main batteries. Wartime industrial focus shifted to ammunition production. From 1943 to 1945, naval arsenals produced 47,000 14-inch projectiles. But production peaked at 2,100 rounds per month in early 1945, a rate that could not keep up with combat expenditure. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, ammunition shortages began restricting fire missions to only the highest priority targets. The final accounting was stark. During the war, these old battleships fired over 23,000 rounds of 14-inch ammunition. Tennessee alone accounted for 9,347 rounds, the most of any ship in United States Navy history. The guns had fired more often than their designers ever imagined possible. They had lasted longer than their specifications suggested. They had proven effective in roles they were never designed to fill. After Japan's surrender, the old battleships were rapidly decommissioned. Though briefly considered for recall during the Korean War, none of the Mark V equipped ships returned to service. The Navy had moved on. The age of the battleship was over. The ships that had made the Pacific Island campaign survivable were cut up for scrap. Tragically, none of the battleships mounting these historic guns were preserved as museum ships. USS Tennessee, the ship that fired more rounds in combat than any other in Navy history, was scrapped in 1959. The weapons that had destroyed Japanese fortifications from Kwajalein to Okinawa were cut apart and sold for steel. But the legacy remained in the doctrine. A modern military assessment confirms what the Navy discovered in 1944. The 14-inch to 50 Mark V was an ideal shore bombardment weapon. Naval historian Robert Ballard noted that while 16-inch guns had more power per shell, the 14-inch gun's combination of sustainable fire rate, higher ammunition capacity, and superb penetration against concrete made them more effective for sustained fire support. The lesson was written in the rubble of Japanese fortifications across the Pacific. The ability to deliver a 1,560-pound projectile with a delayed action fuse through 6 feet of reinforced concrete was exactly the capability that made amphibious assaults survivable. Without these weapons, the casualties at Iwo Jima and Okinawa would have been catastrophic. The Marines who stormed those volcanic beaches understood this. They saw what happened when 14-inch shells hit Japanese positions. They watched fortifications that had withstood days of bombardment by modern cruisers vanish under fire from guns designed in 1912. They knew that the old battleships, the ships many admirals wanted to retire, were the weapons that saved their lives. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications, because next week we are covering another forgotten weapon that changed Pacific naval warfare when conventional doctrine failed. Every single week, we show you the innovations and field modifications that won battles while headquarters was still arguing about strategy. This is not entertainment. This is education you will not find anywhere else. Thank you for watching. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem comes from weapons that everyone has written off as obsolete. The old battleships with their ancient guns proved more valuable than the modern cruisers with their sophisticated fire control systems. The 14-inch Mark V, designed for a war that never happened, instead became the weapon that made victory possible in a war its designers never imagined. The problem facing Marines on those volcanic islands found its solution in weapons built 3 decades earlier for an entirely different purpose. The 14-inch 50 Mark V naval gun, designed for fleet actions against enemy battleships, became the weapon that turned impregnable fortresses into rubble and made amphibious assaults survivable. Hit subscribe right now, then hit like so YouTube shows this to more people who need to understand that military capability comes from recognizing what weapons can do, not what they were designed to do. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what other forgotten weapon from the Pacific War you want covered next. This community is keeping these stories alive.